Hey, welcome to my final year forum. Let's start it off with some iMovie transitions. Here we are in first year. I made a film called 38, of footage I took over 38 days, all filmed on my iPhone. Sorry about the shitty quality, I don't have the actual film with me, so I've just screen recorded bits off of YouTube. But this was exhibited alongside a sketchbook that I made of writing and drawings and things I collected over the 38 days, and I left the last pages free for people to write in, encouraging them to share anything from those 38 days, and that was my favorite thing, seeing what people put in. I traveled quite a bit over those days, and I like how things that I noticed were always the same. There were many birds and hands and windows and discarded objects and strangers unaware of me filming them. All these things have been a continuous element in all my work after this, as you'll see throughout the presentation. I never realized how little my interests have changed till I look back on this film. I initially thought that people would watch bits of it and leave, but I was surprised to see just how many people, especially strangers, stayed for the whole thing, and it really consolidated this human interest in intrusive looking, like a banal voyeurism. In this film, there's a bit where two boys were pissing in public at the beach, which takes us to year two. Since then, I noticed men pissing everywhere, especially at night when drunk, and just became kind of obsessed with it. I won't show the film for legal reasons, but here are zoomed in screenshots. I was interested in the narratives of public versus private. This was the first time that issues with consent were flagged up, so to counteract that, I started going up to the men and asking if I could film. But I guess if they were drunk enough to be pissing on the street and let some art student film them, it doesn't really count as consent. And then that adds a whole other layer of issues with intoxication and consent. But I found it really surprising the willingness of the men to be filmed, albeit drunkenly, but this one guy literally whipped his full dick out, and I thought it was funny seeing how they'd start to perform when I asked if I could film. They would change their stance and try and look manlier, whatever that means. Literally, it was like a pissing contest. This was all filmed on my phone because I never knew when I'd spot a man pissing. It was suggested to me in a crit to use a better camera, but I thought it would be a bit bizarre walking to men with a giant lens while their peeps were out. It's not that important to me that I have the fanciest equipment, but more that when I have an idea, I just want to be able to do it and convey what I want to convey. I also quite enjoy the low quality, and keeping on brand with that shitty production value, I made a life-size paper mache toilet, and the idea was that you'd kind of have to stand over it like you're pissing to watch the film that was shown in the toilet bowl. I was interested in the surveillance aspect of this illegal act. I had screenshots of the footage put up in a CCTV-esque manner, and I liked the narratives of institutional surveillance coming through there. Also, here are some silly sketches I made whenever I wasn't filming or editing. Moving on from one masculine dominated realm to another, that summer I became infatuated by these mejlis in Bahrain. They're like outside communal areas. This is one of the more high tech ones. They had hooked up an electric cable connected to a fan, a satellite dish, and a TV locked in that box with just a flimsy padlock. Most mejlis, as you'll see, are made using discarded furniture. I like this element of world making and community building. I also enjoy the documentation of the remnants of human activity, which highlights this voyeuristic aspect of me entering the spaces uninvited and just looking. Having seen them my whole life, I realized I didn't know that much about mejlis and how they function. Because it was summer, people only go at night because it's too hot otherwise. So after filming in the day, I went after dark to try and speak to the men and ask them questions. At one of the mejlis I visited, the guy said that he had built or curated the space 40 years ago and only his friends were allowed to sit there. He agreed to be filmed as I interviewed him, but only if I didn't show it in Bahrain because there were so many beer cans in the background. He gave me some basil that he had grown on the land, and I really enjoyed the exchange, especially as someone who would not usually be invited to sit with them, because normally people are quite exclusive and territorial about their spaces. I was interested in what the equivalent of a mejlis would be in England, perhaps the council putting up benches encouraging sitting and talking, but I don't think it's the same. I decided the equivalent was the pub, and I didn't do much of this because I was focused on dissertation and then it was locked down, but some big magic happened 2 years later, which is what I'm working on now. My dissertation played a huge role in consolidating my interests. I looked at the artist's gaze in the everyday in the works of Sophie Calle, Shizuka Yokomizo, and Hassan Elahi. This really solidified my interest in the politics of looking, conceptual control versus chance, the relationships between strangers, rigorous documentation, surveillance, and the line between public and private. During lockdown, I couldn't film strangers like I usually do. I made this film in March when I came back to Bahrain and had a 14-day quarantine and had to stay home, although I did take many car rides. This forced me to turn the camera inwards, documenting personal relationships and even including elements of myself in the work, which I had always avoided in fear of my work appearing quite vlog like, if that makes sense. It was all filmed on my iPhone as usual, which is very important to me because a lot of my work is centered around unplanned moments. I like the magic of being given an opportunity to notice something and no one noticing that I've noticed it. Also, when I'm not asking for consent, I like the subtlety of people not being intimidated or then performing for a camera. My dad, especially, becomes quite the performer as soon as he spots a lens, so I've become quite good at the subtlety of filming unnoticed. Before I get on to fourth year and what I'm working on now, I'm just going to throw in some work which I've not spoken about. It's mostly of food, and I've half done this so that I can plug my Instagram that I run with Freya at Quarantine Cooking Queens. Follow us, buy some bagel seasoning. Because a lot of my practice is filming and waiting for inspiration to strike and narratives to form, I'm always working on other things when I'm in the studio. I do a lot of writing, which I hate sharing, and these are some little drawings and little projects that I've done and exhibitions that I've been a part of. And finally, fourth year. I found this year quite tough because issues of consent and safety were majorly flagged up. I couldn't film most of the things that I had planned on filming because I'm still awaiting approval of consent forms, but we moved. I kind of just continued filming and waited for something to happen that would be approved. This is some of that footage. I've been thinking a lot about consent and what that means and how I can kind of bypass it without taking away from the rawness of filming people who are unaware, and also how even when people are aware, how I can make it so that the rawness can still be maintained. Anyways, I took this video of a seagull on a pole with lots of CCTV cameras and became quite obsessed with it. I continued with this series, I guess because I don't have to ask birds for their consent, and I like the narratives of surveillance and birds as this all-seeing power, and the CCTV which isn't asking me for consent, and maybe I'm jealous that it doesn't have to. I made a lot of work exploring the pub. Tash and I collaborated on this exhibition that some of you came to. It was a pub funeral. I spoke to my dad about conducting a funeral because it's something that he does quite often as part of his job. From that conversation, I made my own funeral service for the pub. I think it's really interesting the way it was received. People who came commented on how emotional it was. I think we were quite wary of how it might be perceived as a flippant and insensitive idea, especially with so many COVID-related deaths. What I did not expect were these messages that my sister's ex sent her about the exhibition. I guess it's up to people what they take from it, but for me, it's about the loss of the pub and what that means in terms of community and culture and the rise in loneliness, but also perhaps using the pub as a vessel to explore the death of so many things during these times. I wrote a script and directed this movie to go along with the audio of my dad explaining the order of service at a funeral. I've linked it, so feel free to watch it. It hits different with the audio. I'd appreciate any feedback as well. This was the first time I properly planned a film and used a good camera. It's really unlike any of my previous work, but I did enjoy the more rigorous process of planning as opposed to my usual approach, which is just filming every day and growing the archive until I get an idea or a narrative that ties things together. I've really loved how collaborative this project has been between me and Tash, but also like Liv and Kai brought us these flowers to the funeral, which I then used in the film the next day. And this is the funeral pamphlet we made and printed for everyone who attended. There were times for everyone to share a testimony, and we all sang together, and many people wrote in the memory book.
Just like your word. 2 glasses of red wine at a time. I didn't love Newcastle until I found some teas.
I had some interesting conversations with my dad about a funeral he conducted over Zoom, and I was intrigued by this dissonant concept of a simultaneously mediated yet tender connection. By Zooming the service, it was collaborative beyond people who physically attended.
And there were these 4 women the last time I went to the pub.
To think about the loss we've all endured.
After a few pints.
First and last time at St. Lee's. It's a wonderful place to be able to play pool.
To accompany the sermon, I made a 40-minute long funeral PowerPoint of footage that I had taken at the pubs over 4 years, with YouTube's top 50 funeral hits playing in the background. And it was crazy seeing how emotional it actually was and how the music elevated it. It also got me thinking about who I make my work for, especially now with more of an inclusion of my friends and family in my work. It felt very special to share it with friends, but also didn't feel exclusively made for them. I guess looking back, it's been really interesting to see the conversation surrounding my work, whether that be in the process during or after its creation, talking to men at the Medulus, people at the pub, people peeing, strangers, friends. That's the aspect of my work that is always my favourite. What I'm working on right now is a video using footage of the Medulus and empty pubs during lockdown. I'm enjoying the narratives of them together, and the audio is my dad comparing the two spaces without knowing I've been thinking about it for 2 years now. Talk about big magic.